Tonight, we're going to talk about Tutankhamun, a boy who technically ruled one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth while barely being able to walk properly. This is not a story of glory. It is a story of discomfort, bad genetics, and a crown that arrived far too early and stayed far too long for someone so fragile. Tutankhamun became pharaoh around the age of 9. At that age, most children in ancient Egypt were learning basic chores, avoiding snakes, and trying not to disappoint their parents. Tutankhamun, instead, was expected to embody divine kingship, uphold cosmic order, and smile politely while priests argued over theology behind him. He likely had very little say in any of this. His father, almost certainly Akhenaten, had just finished running Egypt through one of its most confusing religious experiments. Akhenaten tried to replace centuries of traditional gods with the exclusive worship of Aten, the sun disk. This caused widespread resentment, administrative chaos, and a general sense that the universe might be slightly out of balance. When Akhenaten died, the problem of fixing all of this quietly fell onto a child with weak bones. Tutankhamun was born into a family where close relatives married close relatives for generations. This was meant to preserve divine bloodlines. What it actually preserved were genetic problems. Modern scans of Tutankhamun's remains suggest he suffered from multiple conditions, including a clubfoot, bone necrosis, and chronic pain. Walking was difficult. Standing for long periods was worse. The idea of him leading military campaigns is, at best, optimistic. Despite this, official art still shows him as strong, athletic, and eternally youthful. Egyptian royal imagery had rules. Pharaohs were perfect. If reality disagreed, reality was ignored. Behind the scenes, Tutankhamun relied heavily on walking sticks. Over 100 were found in his tomb, which suggests daily movement was slow, careful, and probably unpleasant. While the boy king sat on the throne, actual decisions were made by adults. Chief among them were a senior court official, and Horemheb, a military commander. These men slowly dismantled Akhenaten's religious reforms, restored the old gods, and quietly erased traces of the previous regime. Tutankhamun's role in this was likely ceremonial. He was present. He nodded. He existed. That was enough. Daily life in the palace was controlled and insulated. Tutankhamun would have been surrounded by servants, tutors, priests, and physicians who did their best with limited medical knowledge. Treatments involved oils, spells, prayers, and remedies that probably smelled worse than they helped. Pain was endured, not cured. He married young, to his half-sister Ankhesenamun. This was normal for royal families and unhealthy for everyone involved. The marriage produced at least 2 children, both stillborn. Their tiny mummified remains were later placed in Tutankhamun's tomb, quietly confirming that even continuity of the royal line was failing. Tutankhamun ruled for about 9 years. In Egyptian terms, this was barely enough time to settle into the throne cushion. By his late teens, his health appears to have worsened. There are signs of infection, possibly malaria, combined with a severe leg injury. Whether the injury caused his death or simply made everything worse remains debated. He died around the age of 19. There were no dramatic final speeches, no grand collapse of empire. Egypt simply moved on. I became pharaoh. Life continued. Tutankhamun was buried quickly, in a tomb likely not intended for him, filled with objects meant to serve him in the afterlife: beds, food, statues, and those many walking sticks. For over 3,000 years, Tutankhamun was forgotten, not because he failed, but because he never had the chance to succeed. His life was short, controlled, painful, and quietly tragic. He was powerful in theory, fragile in reality, and remembered not for what he did but for what survived him. After Tutankhamun's burial, Egypt did what large civilizations tend to do very well. It adjusted. The court reorganized itself. Officials rearranged titles, and priests returned statues of old gods to their familiar places. The disruption caused by Akhenaten's religious experiment was slowly patched over, like a cracked wall that everyone agrees not to talk about anymore. Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed, marked, and then promptly lost to time. This was not unusual. The Valley of the Kings was already crowded, confusing, and full of half-finished projects. Floods, debris, and later construction buried entrances. Tomb robbers focused on larger, more obvious targets. Tutankhamun, young and relatively unimportant, was not high on anyone's list. This obscurity would have continued indefinitely if not for a combination of persistence, luck, and early 20th century archaeology. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered the steps leading down to a sealed doorway. When he peered inside with a candle, he reportedly saw wonderful things. What he saw, more accurately, was clutter. The tomb was small, unusually small for a pharaoh. It was packed so tightly with objects that moving through it required patience and careful planning. Chariots stacked on beds, furniture pressed against walls, statues blocking doorways. It looked less like a carefully curated royal burial and more like a storage room that had been sealed in a hurry. This fit the pattern of Tutankhamun's life rather well. The objects inside the tomb told a quiet story. There were fine ceremonial items meant to project power, alongside deeply practical things: sandals, linen garments, boxes of food, medical supplies, and again, walking sticks. So many walking sticks. They were not symbolic, they were used. Some were worn smooth at the handle, suggesting constant reliance. His famous gold mask, now iconic, was likely not made specifically for him. Evidence suggests it was adapted from another royal burial. Even in death, Tutankhamun inherited what was available. His afterlife, like his reign, was assembled quickly and efficiently. Modern examination of his remains has added layers to the story. CT scans revealed fractures, deformities, and signs of disease. The damage to his left leg was severe. Combined with malaria, it would have left him weak, feverish, and in constant pain. Travel would have been difficult, ritual appearances exhausting, sitting upright for long ceremonies probably unbearable. Ancient Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time, but it had limits. Doctors could treat wounds, set bones, and prescribe herbal remedies. They could not fix genetic disorders or systemic infections. Much of healing relied on ritual and prayer. When those failed, endurance took over. Tutankhamun's daily schedule would have been slow, carefully managed. He was likely assisted when walking, helped when dressing, and monitored constantly. Privacy was minimal. Authority was theoretical. Advisors spoke for him. Priests interpreted his will. Soldiers protected a king who rarely moved far from his chambers. And yet, in inscriptions and official records, everything appears normal. Victories are declared. Order is restored. The gods are pleased. This was the job of royal propaganda. Egypt needed stability. It needed the appearance of continuity. A fragile teenager with a limp did not fit the message. After his death, Tutankhamun's name was deliberately downplayed. Later rulers had no interest in celebrating a minor king connected to a controversial period. His monuments were repurposed. His cartouches were overwritten. His existence faded into footnotes. Ironically, this erasure is what saved him. While other tombs were looted, stripped, and destroyed, Tutankhamun slept undisturbed. His obscurity became his protection. The world forgot him completely, which turned out to be extremely useful. When he was rediscovered, modern culture filled in the gaps with drama, curses, mysteries, murders, conspiracies. These stories say more about modern fascination than ancient reality. Tutankhamun did not die dramatically. He did not rule boldly. He did not change the course of history. He endured it. His legacy is not one of conquest or reform. It is a reminder that power does not guarantee comfort, health, or control. Sometimes it simply guarantees that your suffering will be well documented and beautifully buried. And sometimes, after 3,000 years, it guarantees that people will finally notice how tired you must have been. By the time Tutankhamun was laid to rest, the machinery of Egyptian power had already shifted away from him. The throne did not sit empty for long. An older court official who had been close to the royal family for years stepped in. This was framed as continuity. In reality, it was a quiet handover that had likely been planned well before the boy king's health failed completely. I was not young. He was not particularly inspiring, but he was alive, functional, and capable of standing for ceremonies without assistance. In ancient Egypt, that counted for a lot. Tutankhamun's widow, Ankhesenamun, suddenly found herself in an uncomfortable position. She was still very young, recently childless, and now politically exposed. There is evidence she wrote a desperate letter to the Hittite king, asking him to send one of his sons to marry her and rule Egypt. This was an extraordinary request. Foreign princes did not become pharaohs, ever. The letter suggests fear and urgency. It suggests that life inside the palace, after Tutankhamun's death, was not calm, supportive, or particularly safe. The Hittite prince never arrived. He was killed along the way. Soon after, Ankhesenamun disappears from history entirely. I married her. This was presented as proper and legitimate. It was also deeply uncomfortable. Ankhesenamun had gone from royal daughter to royal wife to political bargaining chip in a matter of months. Tutankhamun's death did not end suffering in the palace. It simply redistributed it. Meanwhile, the official narrative of Tutankhamun's reign began to solidify. He was remembered as the king who restored order, temples reopened, old gods returned. This allowed later rulers to use him as a convenient bridge between chaos and stability. He became a useful symbol, even if no one cared much about the actual boy behind it. This pattern is common in history. Fragile rulers are often turned into neat explanations after they're gone. For centuries, Tutankhamun existed only in fragments, a name here, a reused statue there. Most Egyptians who came after him would not have recognized his name. His face did not appear on popular monuments. His deeds were not recited in schools or temples. He was quietly overwritten. Time passed. Empires rose and fell. The Valley of the Kings filled with debris, huts, and later, tourists. People walked over Tutankhamun's tomb for generations without knowing it was there. This would have amused him if he had been capable of amusement by that point. When modern archaeologists finally opened his tomb, the shock was not about Tutankhamun himself. It was about preservation, gold that had not been touched, linen that still held its shape, food offerings still sealed. It felt like interruption rather than discovery. The public response was immediate and dramatic. Newspapers invented curses. Ordinary illnesses and accidents were woven into supernatural stories. The idea that disturbing a pharaoh's tomb would bring death was far more exciting than the reality of poor ventilation and early 20th century medical care. Tutankhamun became famous almost overnight, more famous in death than he ever was alive. This sudden celebrity had consequences. His image was reproduced endlessly. His mask became a global icon. Museums built entire wings around him. Yet even here, the real person remained distant. The narrative focused on treasure, mystery, and spectacle. Pain did not photograph well. Only later did researchers begin to look closely at his body, rather than his belongings. And what they found was not glamorous. Deformities, evidence of chronic illness, signs of physical stress. Tutankhamun had not lived like a god. He had lived like a patient. His days were likely structured around managing discomfort. Short walks, long rests, endless rituals that required standing still while wearing heavy regalia. Even breathing inside ceremonial masks and crowns would have been exhausting. For a healthy adult, it would be unpleasant. For him, it was probably unbearable. Yet he endured it quietly. There are no records of rebellion, complaints, or defiance. He did what was expected. He existed where he was placed. His tragedy was not dramatic. It was administrative. Tutankhamun's story reminds us that history often celebrates outcomes, not experiences. We remember gold masks, not aching legs. We admire thrones, not the bodies that failed beneath them. His life was brief, constrained, and shaped entirely by others' expectations. And perhaps that is why, after so many centuries, his story still feels strangely relatable. Being important does not always mean being comfortable. Being powerful does not mean being well. And sometimes, being remembered means never having been truly seen at all. As Tutankhamun's fame grew in the modern world, something quietly ironic happened. The more gold and grandeur people admired, the further they drifted from the actual experience of his life. Museums displayed objects under bright lights. Documentaries spoke in excited tones. None of this matched the reality of a teenager who likely spent most of his reign tired, in pain, and waiting for ceremonies to end. In ancient Egypt, being pharaoh was not a job you could resign from. It was a condition. Once crowned, you were expected to perform divinity daily, regardless of how your body felt. Tutankhamun did not wake up and decide whether he felt like ruling. The schedule arrived whether he was ready or not. Morning rituals were long and precise. Clothing alone could take significant time. Linen layers, jewelry, symbolic regalia. Each piece had meaning. Each piece also had weight. For someone with joint problems and a damaged leg, standing still while dressed like a moving shrine would have been exhausting before the day even began. Then came appearances, audiences with priests, formal blessings, ceremonies meant to reassure the population that the gods were pleased and order was intact. Tutankhamun's physical presence mattered more than his words. He did not need to speak much. He simply needed to be there, upright, visible, and alive. This expectation created a strange contradiction. The king was divine, yet clearly unwell. Rather than address this, the system ignored it. Servants adapted. Advisors filled gaps. Art corrected reality. The illusion of a strong ruler was maintained at all costs, even if the ruler himself paid for it physically. Tutankhamun's mobility issues meant travel was limited. Military campaigns were out of the question. Most decisions happened indoors, in familiar spaces. This reduced his exposure to danger, but it also reduced his independence. The palace became both sanctuary and confinement. Outside those walls, Egypt functioned efficiently. Farmers worked the land, taxes were collected, temples resumed their rituals to familiar gods. To the average person, the king was distant and abstract. Whether he limped or suffered was irrelevant. As long as the Nile flooded and the gods were honored, order was considered intact. This distance protected Tutankhamun from public scrutiny, but it also ensured no one truly knew him. There are no personal letters, no recorded complaints, no glimpses of humor, frustration, or fear. His personality, if he had the space to develop one, remains unknown. Even his death appears to have been quiet. No records describe panic or mourning on a national scale. The transition of power happened smoothly enough to suggest preparation. This implies that those around him had accepted the inevitable well before it occurred. His burial followed protocol, but not extravagance. The tomb was modest. The haste was visible. Objects were repurposed. Paint was unfinished in places. This was not neglect. It was practicality. Egypt needed to move forward. And then, it forgot him. For Tutankhamun, obscurity may have been the closest thing to peace he ever experienced. No expectations, no ceremonies, no need to stand, walk, or perform. Just stillness, sealed away from responsibility. The tragedy of his life is not that it ended young. It is that it never truly belonged to him. From birth to burial, decisions were made by others. His body bore the consequences. His name carried the weight. History often asks what a ruler accomplished. In Tutankhamun's case, a better question might be what he endured. And endurance, while less impressive than conquest, requires a quieter kind of strength. If Tutankhamun ever thought about the future, it was probably in very practical terms. Would his leg hurt less tomorrow? Would the fever return? Would the ceremonies be shorter? The grand ideas of legacy and eternity, so central to Egyptian kingship, likely felt abstract compared to the daily reality of managing his own body. Ancient Egyptian belief placed enormous emphasis on the afterlife. Tombs were prepared with care, meant to provide comfort and stability beyond death. Ironically, Tutankhamun's tomb suggests that more thought may have gone into his afterlife than his life itself. Objects were placed to ensure he could eat, rest, travel, and exist without pain. In death, he was finally equipped with what life denied him. The beds found in his tomb were carefully crafted, some with curved surfaces that may have been designed to support a weakened body. Chairs were fitted with footrests. These details suggest that even in preparation for eternity, his physical limitations were quietly acknowledged. The afterlife, at least in theory, would be gentler. This contrast is telling. While alive, his condition had to be hidden. While dead, it could be accommodated. Tutankhamun's reign coincided with a period of quiet repair. Temples damaged or neglected under Akhenaten were restored. Priests returned to familiar rituals. Old gods resumed their roles as if nothing unusual had happened. This restoration was later credited to Tutankhamun himself, though it was almost certainly driven by his advisors. Still, his name became attached to healing and balance, even if his own health never improved. There is something deeply ironic about a king remembered for restoring order while living in constant physical disorder. His body did not follow divine symmetry. His strength did not match the idealized form carved into stone. Yet the system around him worked carefully to maintain the appearance of harmony. In many ways, Tutankhamun functioned as a symbol more than a person. His youth made him useful. His silence made him safe. His fragility made him manageable. He did not challenge authority. He did not impose radical change. He allowed others to guide Egypt back to something familiar. This made his reign successful by administrative standards. There were no major rebellions, no civil collapse, no visible fractures. For the people making decisions behind him, this was ideal. Stability mattered more than personality. For Tutankhamun himself, stability likely meant routine, the same rooms, the same faces, the same carefully controlled movements. Life was predictable, but not free. Comfort existed, but only within strict limits. When illness worsened near the end of his life, there is no evidence of panic. The court had seen this coming. Plans were in place. Tomb equipment had likely been prepared in advance. Death, like kingship, was managed. This calm acceptance feels unsettling to modern sensibilities. A 19-year-old dying should provoke alarm. In ancient Egypt, it provoked logistics. Tutankhamun's story is not tragic because it ended early. It is tragic because it unfolded exactly as expected. Born into a system that valued symbols over individuals, he performed his role until his body could no longer sustain it. He did not fail Egypt. Egypt simply used him up. And when his part was finished, the world continued, without pausing to notice how much effort it must have taken just for him to exist. The physical remains of Tutankhamun tell a story that written records never bothered to include. Bones do not flatter. They do not exaggerate. They simply remain where they were left, quietly recording what life felt like from the inside. Examinations of his skeleton reveal asymmetry, stress damage, and signs of repeated strain. His left foot, severely affected by a clubfoot condition, would have altered the way he walked, stood, and balanced. Over time, this would have placed additional pressure on his knees, hips, and spine. Pain would not have been occasional. It would have been routine. This helps explain the number of walking sticks buried with him. They were not ceremonial props. They were tools. Some are elaborately decorated, but many show wear consistent with daily use. He leaned on them. He depended on them. They compensated for a body that refused to cooperate with royal expectations. In public art, none of this appears. Pharaohs are always symmetrical, athletic, and eternally capable. This was not dishonesty in the modern sense. It was theological necessity. A visibly broken king suggested a broken cosmos. The image had to be maintained, regardless of cost. That cost was paid privately. Tutankhamun's physicians likely did what they could. Herbal treatments for inflammation, ointments for wounds, rituals to appease gods associated with healing, incantations spoken carefully over aching limbs. These methods offered comfort, not cures. When pain returned, as it always did, it was endured again. Sleep may not have been restful. Infections, fevers, and chronic discomfort make rest shallow and irregular. The irony of modern viewers watching his story to fall asleep would not be lost on him had he ever slept easily himself. His role as pharaoh required frequent ritual purity, washing, anointing, dressing. Each step demanded physical participation. There was no concept of accommodation. The king performed because the king must perform. If this meant enduring pain quietly, that was considered acceptable. Despite all this, there is no evidence of resentment, no rebellion, no attempt to escape responsibility. Tutankhamun did not challenge the structure that confined him. He functioned within it until he could not. This compliance made him ideal. From the perspective of power brokers, he was predictable, controllable, and symbolic. He stabilized Egypt simply by existing long enough for others to repair what had been disrupted before him. In a different life, he might have been a quiet scholar, or a priest, or someone entirely unremarkable who lived longer by moving less. Instead, he was placed at the center of everything, where movement was constant and rest was rare. When his health declined sharply near the end, it likely did so quickly. Infections spread easily in a body already compromised. A fractured leg, possibly from a fall, would have been catastrophic. Healing required immobility. Kingship did not allow for it. His death was probably not dramatic. More likely, it was gradual. Weakness, fever, exhaustion, then stillness. The court responded efficiently. Rituals were followed. Titles transferred. Egypt continued. Tutankhamun's body, finally relieved of expectation, was prepared for eternity. In death, he was straightened, wrapped, adorned, and presented as whole. The image was complete at last. It is a strange comfort that the version of Tutankhamun most people recognize, the calm face behind the gold mask, may be the only time he was allowed to appear unburdened. The world Tutankhamun inhabited was orderly on the surface and unforgiving underneath. Every ritual had a purpose. Every movement carried symbolic weight. This left very little room for weakness and absolutely no room for rest. The system did not pause because a king was tired. From a young age, Tutankhamun was trained to behave like something other than a person. He was taught how to sit, how to stand, how to gesture. Each motion was slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. Any deviation could be interpreted as disorder. Pain, therefore, had to be hidden behind posture. This training likely began before his physical limitations became obvious. As his health declined, the expectations did not. Instead, the effort required to meet them increased. What looked calm from a distance may have required intense concentration up close. Tutankhamun's days were shaped by repetition, repeated prayers, repeated ceremonies, repeated reassurances that everything was fine. Routine provided stability for the state, but it also meant that discomfort returned again and again without variation. There was no novelty to distract from it. His youth made this harder. Children adapt quickly, but they also feel intensely. Chronic pain during adolescence shapes how the world is experienced. It limits curiosity. It shortens patience. It narrows possibility. Tutankhamun's world likely became smaller with each passing year. Despite this, he was expected to appear eternal. The concept of kingship in ancient Egypt depended on continuity. The pharaoh was not meant to change. He was meant to endure. Even illness had to be framed as temporary, manageable, or irrelevant. A permanently unwell king created theological discomfort, so discomfort was managed quietly. Servants learned his pace. Advisors timed ceremonies carefully. Rooms were arranged to minimize distance. None of this was recorded as compassion. It was recorded as efficiency. The system adjusted, not out of empathy, but to preserve itself. Outside the palace, the population carried on with little awareness of this. Most people would never see the king in person. For them, Tutankhamun existed as an image on temple walls and reliefs. Strong, upright, ideal. This distance protected the illusion. Inside the palace, the illusion was maintained with effort. When he appeared in public, he was supported invisibly. When he was absent, excuses were made in religious language. The gods demanded contemplation. The king was in communion. The explanation always sounded dignified. This separation between image and reality widened over time. The more fragile Tutankhamun became, the more flawless his depiction needed to be. Art grew more confident as the body weakened. Stone did what flesh could not. In this way, Tutankhamun was preserved twice, once in death and once in narrative. His short reign left few decisions directly attributed to him. This has frustrated historians, but it also reveals something important. Tutankhamun was not allowed to be wrong. Silence was safer than opinion. Presence mattered more than action. This made his kingship passive but stable. And stability, in that moment, was considered success. When he died, the machine simply adjusted again. New names, new titles, familiar rituals. The mask stayed in place. Tutankhamun's life, when viewed closely, is not dramatic. It is restrained, controlled, carefully managed until the end. There are no moments of rebellion or transformation, just persistence. And perhaps that is why his story feels strangely quiet, even when surrounded by gold. Modern fascination with Tutankhamun often says more about us than about him. We are drawn to mystery, youth, and sudden death. We prefer stories with sharp edges and dramatic turns. Tutankhamun's life, however, resists that structure. It was not a mystery while it was happening. It was a slow, predictable narrowing of options. The idea of a curse attached to his tomb is a good example. After its discovery, several people connected to the excavation died within a few years. This was presented as supernatural retaliation. In reality, early 20th century archaeology involved poor ventilation, exposure to mold, bacteria, and long-distance travel at a time when medicine was limited. Death did not need an ancient explanation. Still, The curse narrative stuck because it added excitement. It made Tutankhamun dangerous, powerful, and vengeful, all things he never was in life. This transformation is revealing. In death, he finally gained agency. He became a figure who acted upon the world rather than being acted upon. The myth corrected what reality denied him. Meanwhile, the quieter truths continued to emerge. Genetic studies suggested severe inbreeding. Medical analysis showed repeated stress and infection. Each new detail made the story less glamorous and more human, and less comfortable. Tutankhamun was not unlucky in a random way. His suffering followed directly from the structure that elevated him. The same system that crowned him also weakened him. Royal bloodlines were preserved through close marriage. Divine authority was concentrated in a single body. When that body failed, the system pretended not to notice. This denial shaped everything. Pain was not discussed. Limitations were not accommodated. Weakness was reframed as temporary. The king endured because the idea of kingship required endurance. If Tutankhamun had lived longer, his life might not have improved. Chronic conditions do not soften with age. Responsibilities increase. Ceremonies grow longer. Expectations solidify. Survival into adulthood would not have meant freedom. It would have meant more of the same. In this sense, his early death may have spared him a longer version of the same exhaustion. That is an uncomfortable thought, but history is full of them. Tutankhamun's story also challenges how we measure importance. He ruled a major empire, yet left little mark. His name was erased, his monuments reused, his existence reduced to administrative necessity. Only an accident of preservation restored him to memory. What we remember, then, is not achievement, but absence. Not action, but endurance. Not legacy, but survival. The gold mask, serene and symmetrical, has become the face of ancient Egypt itself. It suggests calm authority and timeless power. It hides asymmetry, pain, and fatigue. It is the version of Tutankhamun the world was always meant to see. Behind it was a boy who rarely chose anything. His meals were chosen. His schedule was chosen. His marriage was chosen. His beliefs were chosen. Even his burial was chosen in haste by others. Control was exercised over him constantly, gently, and without malice. This made it more complete. There is no villain in his story, just a system functioning as designed. And that may be the most unsettling part. Tutankhamun was not destroyed by cruelty or neglect. He was sustained by care that never questioned its own cost. When people speak of him today, they often use words like tragic and mysterious. A more accurate description might be tired. Tired before adulthood. Tired before choice. Tired before the possibility of a different life. In a world obsessed with power, Tutankhamun reminds us that power can be deeply passive. That being central does not mean being free. That importance can feel very much like confinement. His life did not explode into legend. It quietly wore out. And sometimes, that is the most human story of all. By the standards of ancient Egypt, Tutankhamun's reign was uneventful. And that, paradoxically, was its greatest achievement. After years of religious upheaval and uncertainty under Akhenaten, the absence of drama felt like relief. No new gods, no radical reforms, no loud declarations, just a quiet return to what had worked before. This calm was not accidental. It was carefully maintained by those around the throne. Stability required predictability, and Tutankhamun provided it, simply by existing. He did not introduce new ideas because no one expected him to. His youth and fragility made ambition unnecessary, even unwelcome. Inscriptions from his reign emphasize restoration rather than innovation. Temples were repaired, offerings resumed. The gods were described as satisfied again. This language mattered. It reassured priests, officials, and the wider population that the cosmic imbalance of the previous reign had been corrected. Tutankhamun became a symbol of repair, even if he never personally wielded the tools. This symbolic role required him to be visible, but not forceful, present, but not commanding. The throne needed a figurehead, not a visionary. For a system recovering from ideological strain, this was ideal. For Tutankhamun himself, this meant a life of containment. His world shrank to what could be managed physically and politically. Decisions happened around him rather than through him. He was consulted, informed, and guided. Agency was minimal, but responsibility remained absolute. The contradiction is striking. As Pharaoh, he was theoretically omnipotent. In practice, he depended on others for movement, speech, and interpretation. Power flowed through him, not from him. This arrangement worked until his body could no longer support it. When illness intensified, the system adjusted again. Duties were reduced. Appearances became rarer. Advisors stepped forward more visibly. Preparations began quietly. Egypt had contingency plans. It always did. Death, when it arrived, did not disrupt the state. That may sound cold, but it was considered success. Continuity mattered more than emotion. The machinery of governance moved smoothly from one name to the next. Tutankhamun's passing was acknowledged, ritualized, and absorbed. What remains unsettling is how little of him survives beyond objects. We have his possessions, his bones, and his image. We do not have his voice. There are no records of his fears, frustrations, or hopes. Even his beliefs are assumed rather than known. This silence is not unusual for ancient rulers, but in his case it feels heavier. So much of his life was controlled that what he might have thought privately becomes almost impossible to imagine. Perhaps he accepted his role without resistance. Perhaps he questioned it quietly. Perhaps he was too tired to do either. History cannot tell us. What it can tell us is that Tutankhamun did not shape his era so much as he absorbed it. He was a vessel for restoration, a pause between disruptions, a human placeholder while Egypt found its balance again. In modern terms, he would not be considered successful. He built no monuments, he led no campaigns, he issued no famous laws. Yet his reign accomplished exactly what was required of it. Nothing dramatic. In a time of exhaustion, that was enough. Tutankhamun's life reminds us that not all significance is loud. Sometimes history moves forward because someone remains still long enough for others to fix what is broken. And sometimes, the quietest reign leaves the deepest trace, not because of what it did, but because of how carefully it endured. As centuries passed, Tutankhamun's absence became complete. His name was omitted from king lists. His memory was not cultivated. Egypt's official history moved forward without him, preferring rulers who could be credited with strength, expansion, or reform. Tutankhamun offered none of these narratives. He was easy to forget, and so he was. This forgetting was not personal, it was practical. Later, pharaohs wanted distance from the Amarna period, with all its religious confusion and political awkwardness. Tutankhamun, despite restoring traditional worship, was still connected by blood and timing to that era. Remembering him too clearly risked reopening uncomfortable associations. Erasure was simpler. As a result, Tutankhamun became invisible long before modern times. When Greeks and Romans encountered Egypt, they saw colossal statues and grand inscriptions, but not him. When medieval travelers described ruins, his name did not surface. He existed only underground, sealed in a quiet corner of the Valley of the Kings, beneath layers of debris and indifference. This long silence shaped how he would later be perceived. When his tomb was finally opened, there was no competing narrative, no famous reign to compare against, no expectations to challenge. Tutankhamun arrived in the modern world as a blank space filled with gold. People assumed importance from preservation. Surely a king so well equipped in death must have been extraordinary in life. The truth, as usual, was less flattering and more interesting. What survived was not evidence of greatness, but evidence of care. His burial goods were thorough because Egyptian belief demanded thoroughness. His tomb was intact because no one thought it worth robbing. His fame was accidental. This accident reshaped Egyptology. Tutankhamun became the lens through which millions first encountered ancient Egypt. For many, he is the default pharaoh. The young face, the golden mask, the quiet gaze. It is worth pausing on how strange this is. Out of hundreds of rulers, the one remembered most vividly is the one who ruled least, suffered most quietly, and achieved almost nothing by conventional standards. His legacy rests entirely on survival of objects, of remains, of space left undisturbed. In this way, Tutankhamun's story mirrors the experience of many lives that history overlooks. People who do what is required, endure what they must, and leave behind little evidence of their inner world. They are not remembered because they did not disrupt the system. They allowed it to continue. Tutankhamun did exactly that. If his life had been louder, his tomb would likely have been looted. If his reign had been longer, his burial would have drawn attention. If his name had mattered more, it would have been reused, erased, or overwritten completely. Obscurity protected him. This reversal where insignificance leads to immortality is one of history's quieter jokes. Tutankhamun never chose to be remembered. He never positioned himself for legacy. He did not cultivate greatness. He simply existed in the narrow space allowed to him until he could not any longer. And because of that, thousands of years later, we are still speaking his name. Not because he conquered, but because he endured. Not because he ruled well, but because he rested undisturbed. Not because he shaped history, but because history passed over him without noticing. And in doing so, it left him perfectly preserved for a future he never imagined. There is a quiet cruelty in how Tutankhamun is usually introduced. He is often called the boy king, a phrase that sounds almost affectionate. It suggests novelty, charm, and innocence. What it does not suggest is chronic pain, limited mobility, or a life structured entirely around managing weakness without acknowledging it. The label makes his story easier to digest. It softens what was, in reality, an exhausting existence. Tutankhamun did not experience childhood in any ordinary sense. His youth was not playful or exploratory. It was ceremonial, educational, perhaps, but tightly constrained. Tutors taught him theology, ritual language, and posture. He learned how to represent authority long before he understood it. There was little room for curiosity, and even less for rebellion. Illness likely accelerated this process. Sick children are often treated as fragile, and fragility invites control. Every movement becomes supervised. Every risk is minimized. Freedom quietly disappears in the name of care. By the time Tutankhamun reached adolescence, his path was already fixed. Marriage was arranged. Appearances were scheduled. Expectations hardened. Any chance to grow into someone else had already passed. This lack of choice is rarely discussed when evaluating ancient rulers. We assume power implies autonomy. In Tutankhamun's case, the opposite was true. The higher his status, the narrower his life became. Even his body became public property. Royal physicians examined him. Priests interpreted his health as a sign from the gods. Advisors monitored his endurance. Pain was no longer private. It was something to be managed for the sake of the state. This level of exposure would have been isolating. Privacy was scarce. Silence was safer than complaint. A king who spoke of discomfort risked appearing weak, and weakness threatened cosmic order. Better to endure quietly. The tomb, once again, provides contrast. In death, his body was treated with care and patience. Wrapped slowly, placed carefully, surrounded by objects chosen to ease his existence beyond life. Death granted him dignity that life often withheld. It is tempting to romanticize this, but it is more accurate to see it as compensation. Ancient Egypt promised comfort after death because life was often harsh, even for kings. Tutankhamun's story also forces us to reconsider what success meant in his world. He did not leave behind chaos. He did not provoke conflict. He did not destabilize the state. By ancient standards, that mattered. By human standards, it feels insufficient. Yet history is full of lives measured not by transformation, but by endurance. People who hold things together simply by remaining present. Who absorb strain so others do not have to. Who are forgotten precisely because they made survival look effortless. Tutankhamun was one of these figures, except his endurance was wrapped in gold. The sadness of his story does not come from mystery or spectacle. It comes from its predictability, from the sense that once he was born into that family, with that body, in that moment, the outcome was already written. He lived as long as his body allowed. He ruled as much as his health permitted. He died when both were exhausted. And the world adjusted, as it always does. When we imagine ancient royalty, we often imagine abundance, endless food, servants, luxury, and leisure. In Tutankhamun's case, abundance existed, but leisure did not. Comfort was available, yet rarely restorative. His environment was designed to support the image of kingship, not the needs of a fragile body. Even food, abundant and carefully prepared, may not have brought much relief. Illness dulls appetite. Pain interrupts digestion. Fevers drain energy regardless of nutrition. What others enjoyed as excess, he likely experienced as obligation. Meals were part of routine, not pleasure. The palace, for all its splendor, functioned more like a controlled institution than a home. Movement was observed, time was scheduled, interactions were purposeful. The idea of wandering freely or sitting alone without ritual significance was probably rare. This kind of life shapes a person inwardly. It narrows emotional range. It encourages compliance. When everything around you is fixed, resistance feels pointless. Tutankhamun likely learned early that endurance was safer than desire. There is no evidence that he dreamed of escape or resented his role. This does not mean he was content. It means he was conditioned. A life spent adapting leaves little room for imagining alternatives. His marriage followed the same pattern. Ankhesenamun was not chosen for companionship. She was chosen for continuity. Their relationship, like everything else, served the system first. The stillbirths they endured were tragedies, but also failures of dynastic expectation. Even grief was political. After the loss of their children, the pressure did not lessen. If anything, it increased. The absence of an heir created urgency. Plans were adjusted. Succession became a quiet concern hovering over daily life. Tutankhamun lived with the awareness, spoken or unspoken, that his body was unreliable, and that this unreliability had consequences beyond himself. He was not just unwell, he was a risk factor. This awareness can be heavy. It creates a sense of being provisional, of existing temporarily, of knowing that one's presence is tolerated only as long as it functions. And still, the ceremonies continued. Ritual does not pause for uncertainty. The sun rose, offerings were made, words were spoken. Tutankhamun participated as long as he could. When he could not, others filled in, gently and without acknowledgement. His decline was likely gradual enough that no single moment marked the end. There was no sudden collapse, just less strength, less movement, less visibility, until one day, absence replaced presence. In this way, his death mirrored his life, quiet, managed, absorbed. The tragedy is not that he was young, or sick, or forgotten. The tragedy is that he was never allowed to be unfinished. Childhood, adolescence, adulthood, these stages blurred into one continuous role. He was always already complete in the eyes of the system. Completion leaves no room for growth. Tutankhamun's story is not about lost potential in the heroic sense. It is about potential that was never considered relevant. His value lay in stability, not development, in continuity, not curiosity. And so, when his body finally failed, the system did not mourn what might have been. It acknowledged what had been sufficient. That, perhaps, is the quietest sorrow of all. The way Tutankhamun was treated after death reveals more about his life than most surviving records. Ancient Egypt invested heavily in burial because death was believed to be a continuation, not an end. The care given to his body suggests an attempt to provide in death what life could not. His mummification was done with precision. Organs were removed and preserved. The body was wrapped in layers of linen, each applied deliberately. Amulets were placed to protect him in the afterlife. Spells were inscribed to guide him safely forward. Everything was meant to ensure wholeness. This attention to wholeness is striking, considering how incomplete his life must have felt. The famous gold mask presents an idealized face, symmetrical, calm, eternally youthful. It shows no pain, no strain, no limitation. This was not how Tutankhamun lived. It is how he was finally allowed to be seen. In death, his image was corrected. The burial goods placed with him suggest concern for comfort, furniture designed for rest, footwear crafted for movement, food offerings prepared in abundance. Even games and entertainment objects were included, perhaps to give him a kind of leisure he never experienced. These choices imply awareness. Those preparing his burial knew he had suffered. They did not say it aloud, but they accounted for it. The afterlife, at least symbolically, would be different. And yet, even this care was shaped by urgency. The tomb was small, objects were crowded, paintings were rushed. The burial was complete, but not leisurely. Egypt was efficient, even in mourning. Once sealed, the tomb became a place of stillness. No more schedules, no more expectations, no more performances. Tutankhamun's role ended. It is tempting to view this stillness as peace, but peace, like power, is difficult to define across time. What we can say is that for the first time, Tutankhamun was no longer required to sustain the system that had shaped him. For centuries, nothing disturbed him. Empires rose and fell above. The world changed completely. He remained where he was placed, untouched and unseen. This long silence preserved him better than reverence ever could. When he was rediscovered, the objects meant to ease his afterlife became exhibits. The mask, meant to present divine perfection, became a symbol of an entire civilization. The careful provisions meant for one tired boy were repurposed to satisfy modern curiosity. In this transformation, his suffering risked being lost again. Modern narratives often focus on mystery and spectacle, the curse, the gold, the drama. What fades into the background is the quiet fact that Tutankhamun never lived long enough to want any of this. His fame arrived thousands of years too late to matter to him. And yet, there is something oddly fitting about that. A king who spent his life being seen as a symbol is remembered not as a person, but as an image, a face without strain, a body without pain. The irony is complete. Tutankhamun's story, at its core, is about containment of illness, of responsibility, of expectation. His burial finally released all of it into stillness. The longer Tutankhamun remains in public memory, the more abstract he becomes. His name now functions as shorthand for ancient Egypt itself. Stripped of context and human detail, he is reduced to a mask, a tomb, and a moment of discovery. The person underneath recedes further each year. This abstraction mirrors what happened during his life. Even while alive, Tutankhamun was rarely encountered as an individual. He was a role first, a symbol second, and a person only in the narrowest, most private moments. His body existed in public space, but his inner life did not. Those closest to him, servants, physicians, attendants, would have seen the gap between image and reality most clearly. They would have known how slowly he moved, how carefully he had to stand, how often he rested. Yet even they participated in maintaining the illusion. Silence was part of their duty. This shared silence formed the atmosphere of his reign. Not secrecy, exactly, but restraint. Everyone understood the limits. Everyone worked around them. No one challenged the structure that produced them. From a distance, this looks like loyalty. From within, it likely felt like inevitability. Tutankhamun's story complicates our understanding of ancient power. We often imagine authority flowing downward, imposed by force or fear. In his case, authority pressed inward. Expectations bore down on a body that could barely carry them. Power was not exercised through him, it rested on him. This is an exhausting way to exist. The rituals that sustained Egypt's worldview required constant repetition. Words had to be spoken precisely. Gestures had to be correct. Timing mattered. These details were believed to maintain cosmic balance. A mistake could threaten order itself. For Tutankhamun, this meant that even small lapses carried symbolic weight. Fatigue was not merely physical, it was theological. Being tired had consequences beyond discomfort, so he endured. Endurance, in this context, was not heroic. It was necessary. It was expected. There were no rewards for it, only continuation. Each day succeeded the last, quietly and predictably, until it did not. When modern audiences look for drama in his story, they often miss this point. The drama was not in sudden events, but in duration, in repetition, in the slow accumulation of strain without release. Tutankhamun did not experience a fall from power. He experienced a gradual fading of capacity. The system around him adjusted, absorbed, and moved on. This was not cruelty, it was functionality. History tends to celebrate moments of rupture. Tutankhamun offers something else, an example of how systems persist by quietly consuming those placed at their center. His life did not collapse, it concluded. And perhaps that is why it feels so distant. There is no single moment to point to, no turning point to analyze, just a steady narrowing until there was nothing left to narrow. When his tomb was sealed, the silence that followed was absolute. No expectations, no rituals, no endurance required. It was the only space in his existence where he was not needed. Even thousands of years later, Tutankhamun's story continues to teach subtle lessons about power and human limitation. Modern fascination emphasizes treasure, curses, and youthful kingship, but the quieter truth lies elsewhere, in endurance, invisibility, and adaptation to circumstances beyond control. His reign was short, his body fragile, and his autonomy minimal. The boy who became Pharaoh was placed at the center of a civilization, yet he experienced it mostly through constraint. Every decision around him, from his movements to his marriages, had already been influenced or determined by others. He rarely exercised real choice. The authority that belonged to him in theory was executed by advisors, priests, and officials. Presence, not action, defined him. Even daily existence was carefully structured. Meals, rituals, appearances, and rest were timed and supervised. Pain had to be masked. Fatigue had to be endured silently. The image of the king mattered far more than the experience of the boy wearing the crown. Tutors, physicians, and attendants all contributed to maintaining this balance, creating a controlled environment in which the pharaoh could function just enough for the state to continue operating smoothly. This persistence, while understated, required its own kind of strength. Tutankhamun's body bore physical suffering. A clubfoot, likely malaria, fractures, and other hereditary complications from generations of intermarriage. Walking, standing, even sitting could be painful. Despite this, he performed his duties for nearly a decade, a testimony to quiet resilience rather than heroic triumph. His tomb, now famous for its treasures, reflects both the care taken and the inefficiencies of planning around his constraints. Walking sticks, beds, and specially crafted furniture indicate awareness of his limitations. Yet the tomb was crowded, hastily decorated, and perhaps not intended to provide the comfort it promised. Even in death, planning was constrained by circumstances and urgency. The irony of Tutankhamun's life is that invisibility, being largely unknown and underestimated, ultimately preserved him. While other pharaohs' tombs were looted or destroyed, his remained intact. Obscurity, combined with care and circumstance, gave him a form of immortality that fame alone could not have secured. Modern audiences, however, often misinterpret this preservation. We project drama, curses, and mystery onto a story that was fundamentally about quiet endurance. The Boy King became famous not because of conquests or reforms, but because he survived, barely, and because the artifacts left behind were exceptional. The gold, the mask, the treasures. These are reminders not of power wielded, but of fragility, honored, and preserved. Tutankhamun's legacy is subtle. It is not one of change, but of continuity, not of action, but of presence. In understanding him, we confront the ways, institutions, and systems shape human life, and how the expectations of others can define a life more than any personal ambition. In the end, Tutankhamun did exactly what was required. He endured, he complied, he existed, and that, quietly, is enough to make history remember him not as a conqueror, but as a witness to the slow machinery of civilization carrying its weight on young, fragile shoulders. The rediscovery of Tutankhamun's tomb brought sudden attention to a life that had been largely invisible for millennia. Scholars and the public alike were captivated, not by his decisions or deeds, but by the objects he left behind: gold, jewelry, ceremonial items. These artifacts became proxies for the Boy King himself, standing in for a person whose experiences had been carefully hidden, both in life and in death. This transformation from overlooked pharaoh to global icon highlights a peculiar truth about history. It often remembers what is preserved rather than what was truly lived. Tutankhamun's life was constrained, uncomfortable, and painfully ordinary in many ways. Yet his tomb, undisturbed for centuries, created a perception of grandeur, drama, and importance far exceeding his actual reign. Even modern portrayals tend to focus on mystery, curses, sudden deaths, treasures. These embellishments mask the quieter, more human aspects: his chronic illness, limited mobility, and constrained autonomy. Yet, it is precisely these conditions that shaped his existence. They dictated the rhythm of his days, the way he moved, the people he interacted with, and ultimately, how long he survived. Tutankhamun's body tells a story that images cannot. Bone analysis reveals not only inherited conditions but also the toll of repeated physical strain. The clubfoot, fractures, and signs of infection would have made standing, walking, and ceremonial duties difficult. Each appearance in the public eye was an effort, a performance under duress. Every ritual and procession demanded endurance, not enthusiasm. The disparity between the idealized image and the lived reality is stark. Wall reliefs depict him as perfectly proportioned, agile, and composed. The mask portrays serenity and divine perfection. In life, he was fragile, constrained, and often in pain. Yet, this contrast was intentional. Egyptian kingship relied on image more than reality. Tutankhamun was required to embody perfection regardless of circumstance. Death, however, provided a measure of relief. His tomb accommodated his limitations with practical furnishings, specialized beds, footrests, and walking sticks. These objects acknowledge the struggles he faced silently while alive. In death, the careful arrangement of his remains allowed for movement, rest, and ritual without the same physical strain. Ironically, the very fragility that made him vulnerable also contributed to his preservation. More imposing or active rulers might have attracted looters or faced more rapid decay. Tutankhamun, small, constrained, and largely overlooked during life, benefited from centuries of obscurity, which ensured the survival of his artifacts and remains for modern discovery. Ultimately, Tutankhamun's story is one of quiet endurance. It is not dramatic in the traditional sense. It is measured, constrained, and shaped by circumstance beyond his control. Yet it resonates precisely because it reflects a universal human experience, the effort to persist, to fulfill expectations, and to survive within the limits of one's body and environment. What makes Tutankhamun's story quietly compelling is how it illuminates the tension between expectation and experience. In theory, he was Egypt's ruler, divine and omnipotent. In practice, he was a fragile teenager constrained by illness, genetics, and the very rituals that defined his authority. The crown he wore symbolized power, but his body bore its weight in ways that were invisible to the outside world. Daily life in the palace would have been a careful balance. Movement was limited. Rituals were repeated with precision. Meals, though plentiful, may have been eaten under observation, with little room for comfort or enjoyment. Tutors, priests, and attendants monitored him constantly. Independence was a luxury he never had. Even minor injuries were amplified by expectation. A fall or strain was not merely physical, it was a symbolic threat. A king out of balance, literally or metaphorically, disrupted cosmic order. Every step, every gesture, carried importance beyond personal significance. Pain became a private burden, layered beneath public duty. His marriage to Ankhesenamun, arranged and politically motivated, illustrates how constrained his personal life was. Their short-lived pregnancies, both resulting in stillbirths, highlight that biological realities were intertwined with dynastic imperatives. Tutankhamun's experience of family and companionship was deeply mediated by duty and expectation. Art and funerary objects both obscured and revealed these truths. Reliefs and statues depict perfection and power. Walking sticks, specialized beds, and medical tools found in his tomb tell a different story, one of fragility, support, and carefully managed movement. In life, these needs were addressed quietly. In death, they were immortalized. His reign accomplished what was necessary: stability. He did not provoke conflict. He did not challenge the system. He endured long enough for advisors to restore balance after the upheaval of Akhenaten's religious reforms. From the perspective of Egypt's functioning state, this was a success. From the perspective of human experience, it was constrained and exhausting. The rediscovery of his tomb amplified the contrast between reality and image. Modern fascination emphasizes treasures, curses, and mystery. Few consider the physical and emotional endurance required just to survive the expectations of kingship. Yet this endurance defines the boy king as much as the gold mask does. Ultimately, Tutankhamun's story is a study in quiet endurance under impossible circumstances. His life did not unfold with the drama modern narratives impose, but it required patience, resilience, and compliance on a scale that is hard to appreciate. He existed as required, performed as demanded, and lived within limits imposed by both body and society. Tutankhamun's death, when it came, was quietly absorbed by the system that had shaped his life. There was no collapse, no dramatic upheaval. The advisors, priests, and officials had long prepared for this inevitability. Succession plans were in place. The machinery of the state continued without interruption, as though the boy king had been a placeholder in a well-oiled engine. In this sense, his life and death were both defined by utility. He existed to maintain continuity, and in that, he succeeded. The throne passed to Ai, who married Ankhesenamun, consolidating authority and smoothing over potential instability. Tutankhamun's absence was acknowledged, but only minimally. The state could not afford extended mourning or disruption. Life in Egypt moved on, as it always had. Modern fascination with Tutankhamun often emphasizes the dramatic or unusual aspects of his tomb and death. People speak of curses, sudden deaths, and treasures beyond imagination. While compelling, these stories obscure a simpler, more human reality that he endured, quietly, as expected, until he could endure no longer. His artifacts, which today are celebrated as symbols of wealth and power, tell a parallel story. Walking sticks reveal fragility. Beds hint at attempts to ease discomfort. Jewelry and masks project perfection. Together, they demonstrate a tension between the ideal and the real, between public image and private limitation. It is in this tension that Tutankhamun's true legacy resides. He illustrates how power can exist without freedom, authority without autonomy, and significance without personal achievement. Endurance, quiet compliance, and survival become the measures of success in a way that conventional narratives often overlook. In life, he was fragile, constrained, and limited. In death, he was preserved, idolized, and immortalized. The contrast is striking. The boy king, who struggled to walk, to stand, to participate in daily life as expected, is now one of the most recognized figures of ancient Egypt. Obscurity, hardship, and fragility have been transmuted into fame, mystery, and fascination. Perhaps this is why his story resonates across millennia. It is not the story of triumph. It is the story of endurance, of living according to the demands of others, often at the expense of self, of existing long enough to be remembered, even if memory arrives centuries too late to matter to him. Tutankhamun did not conquer, legislate, or innovate. He persisted, and that, quietly, is enough to make us consider what history truly values: presence, continuity, and the careful maintenance of expectation. As time passed after Tutankhamun's death, his presence faded from collective memory, leaving only the objects he had been buried with. His tomb remained hidden beneath layers of sand, debris, and centuries of neglect. For millennia, Egypt carried on without him, the empire steady, the religious order restored, and the daily lives of its people largely uninterrupted. The boy king existed only as a ghost of obligation and tradition, quietly holding a place that required him to be there, even if no one acknowledged his experience. The rediscovery of his tomb in the 20th century transformed him instantly into a symbol, a figure larger than life. Gold, intricate jewelry, ceremonial artifacts, all were interpreted as reflections of his power, wealth, and status. Yet the truth beneath the surface remained far less glamorous. These treasures were not trophies of achievement. They were tools, carefully arranged to meet expectations both practical and symbolic. Walking sticks, beds, and supports told of pain endured silently. Food and linens suggested care for a body that had often been taxed beyond its capacity. Even in death, his limitations were acknowledged indirectly. This duality, image versus reality, is central to understanding Tutankhamun. The mask presents divine perfection, symmetrical, youthful, serene. The body beneath reveals fragility, chronic illness, and repeated strain. His fame, generated by treasures and myth, obscures endurance, quiet suffering, and constrained agency. And yet, endurance itself is a remarkable feat. Living as expected, fulfilling symbolic roles, and surviving in spite of pain constitutes a form of achievement rarely celebrated. Tutankhamun's life was governed by systems larger than himself: dynastic imperatives, religious mandates, and the physical realities of a compromised body. He conformed, adapted, and persisted within these confines. Modern fascination overlays drama and narrative onto a fundamentally muted story. Curses, treasures, and the boy king label impose excitement where there was none. The reality of Tutankhamun's life is quieter, a life of careful management, physical endurance, and the unglamorous fulfillment of expectation. the paradox is striking. In life, he was constrained, largely unseen, and overshadowed by advisors and ritual. In death, he was immortalized, celebrated, and finally able to rest, the care of his burial granting what life could not. Thus, Tutankhamun's story remains compelling not because of conquest, innovation, or heroic action, but because it illustrates the human cost of maintaining systems larger than oneself. He existed at the center of power without truly possessing it, lived within limits defined by others, and endured circumstances far beyond ordinary human experience. And yet, enduring quietly, without fanfare, is what ultimately ensured his place in history. Tutankhamun's life and legacy offer a meditation on endurance, invisibility, and the quiet mechanics of history. He did not rule through charisma, conquest, or radical innovation. Instead, he persisted. He occupied a space defined by expectation, fragility, and obligation. The crown he wore symbolized divinity and power, but his body bore the realities of genetics, illness, and chronic strain. Authority rested on him, yet autonomy eluded him. His presence maintained balance, even as his own comfort was compromised. Daily life was meticulously structured. Rituals, appearances, and ceremonies dictated movement, posture, and attention. Meals were plentiful, but not restful. Advisors guided decisions, priests observed, and servants adjusted every detail to ensure he could perform adequately. Pain and fatigue were constant companions, yet largely invisible to those outside his immediate household. In many ways, his endurance defined his kingship more than any decree or military action ever could. Death brought relief, though not spectacle. Preparations were made to accommodate limitations. Beds, footrests, and walking sticks were included in his tomb. His mummified body was wrapped and adorned to reflect perfection, masking the physical struggles he had endured. In life, he had been a fragile participant in a rigid system. In death, he was idealized and preserved, both physically and symbolically. The contrast between life and afterlife underscores a recurring theme. What history often remembers is not lived experience, but carefully curated representation. Tutankhamun's gold mask, treasures, and intact tomb capture attention. His chronic pain, limited mobility, and constrained agency are largely invisible. Yet these realities shaped his life more than any artifact could. His quiet endurance, compliance, and survival allowed Egypt to stabilize after religious upheaval and dynastic uncertainty. Modern fascination with Tutankhamun, from curses to cinematic depictions, emphasizes drama where none existed. The real story is subtler. A boy king navigating impossible expectations, a fragile body performing constant service, and a society that depended on his presence rather than his action. His fame is accidental, his survival remarkable, and his legacy defined by endurance rather than conquest. In reflecting on Tutankhamun, we are reminded that history often honors presence over agency, stability over ambition, and endurance over triumph. His life was constrained, painful, and meticulously managed. Yet, in enduring quietly, he achieved a form of immortality. Thousands of years later, his story persists, not as a tale of heroism, but as a testament to the quiet, often overlooked labor required simply to exist in a world larger than oneself. And that, gently, concludes the life and death of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh whose quiet endurance left a mark that outlived even the wealth and gold buried with him.